One of the most common questions I get these days is, in Betaflight, what should I set my loop time to? And I'm going to answer that question for you now. It turns out that in Betaflight, in the most recent versions of Betaflight, you don't actually set the loop time anymore. There are actually two parameters that you set that control two different things. One is the rate at which the gyro chip is read, and one is the rate at which the PID loop actually acts on that data. So the PID loop is the one that's most analogous to the old loop time parameter. But these two parameters work together to set the ultimate loop time that will result. And I'm not going to go into more detail about exactly what they are. I'm just going to tell you what the values should be that you're going to want to set them to. The values that you set them to depend on two factors. One is the processor that is on your board, and that'll be either the F1 or the F3 processor. Those of you who are wondering about F4, set that aside for a minute. We're going to focus on F1 and F3 here. The other factor is the protocol that your board uses, which will be either I2C or SPI. Okay, so if you have an F1 board with the I2C protocol, such as the NAS32 or the KISS, then you're going to need to set your gyro sync denom to 2, which will give you a gyro rate of 4 kilohertz. And by the way, if you're using the Betaflight configurator, you can just manually enter 4 kilohertz from the pull-down menu. If you're using the CleanFlight configurator, or if you're on an earlier version of Betaflight that isn't supported by the Betaflight configurator, then you're going to need to go to the CLI and you're going to manually type set gyrosync denom equals 2. Now the reason that you need to set your gyrosync denom to 2 or a 4 kilohertz rate is that the I2C bus just cannot support a faster read rate than 4 kilohertz, at least not given the current state of the technology that we're using. Okay, so you simply can't go faster than that. Then you're going to need to set your PID process denom to 2, which will give you a PID process rate of 2 kilohertz. And the reason for that is that the F1 processor just can't go any faster while keeping its CPU utilization acceptably low. Technically, you can run it at 2.6 kilohertz, but Boris has said, and I agree, that you're getting a tiny amount of additional speed there for not much benefit, and there's a much bigger risk that your CPU utilization will be too high. So if you've got an F1 board with an I2C protocol like NAS32 and KISS, these are the settings that I would use, and that's just that. If you've got an F1 board with SPI, like the CC3D, you can run your gyrosync denom at 1, which gives you an 8 kilohertz read rate from the gyro, and that's because the SPI protocol is faster and you can read the gyro faster. However, you still cannot run the PID loop any faster than 2 kilohertz due to the limitations of the F1 processor. So again, for the F1 boards, there's not a lot of discussion to go on there. You run the gyro at either 4 or 8 kilohertz, you run the PID process at 2 kilohertz, and that's just the end of the story. If you have an F3 board with an I2C interface, such as the FPV model F303 v2.0, 2.1, or even 1.0, the Moto Tornado, or the SP Racing F3 Mini, then again, because of the limitations of the I2C interface, your gyro rate cannot be faster than 4 kilohertz, a gyrosync denom of 2. Your PID process denom can be either 1 for a 4 kilohertz or 2 for a 2 kilohertz rate. It's possible you could also do a 2.6 kilohertz rate. I'm not sure what the denom would be there, but anyway, it can be either 4 kilohertz or 2 kilohertz. It's important to note that as long as you are using motor output that is synced to the PID process, which is the default setting, then there's no way to run the PID process at faster than the gyro rate. So for example, if you've got a gyro rate of 4 kilohertz, you cannot run the PID process faster than 4 kilohertz. There is an option in Betaflight to unsynchronize the motor output from the PID process and run the motor output faster than the PID process, and there is some healthy debate about whether that's beneficial or not, which is again not a topic for this video. Suffice to say, we're going to assume you're syncing your motor output to your gyrosync rate, at which point there's no point in running the PID process faster than the gyrosync. In fact, you simply can't do it. Finally, if you've got an F3 processor with the SPI protocol, and this is pretty much the gold standard for Betaflight right now. Examples of boards like this include the FPV model X-Racer F303 v3.0, the Moto Cyclone, and the SP Racing F3 Evo. You're going to want to run your gyrosync denom at 1, which is an 8 kilohertz rate, and your PID process denom could be anywhere from 1 for an 8 kilohertz rate to 4 for a 2 kilohertz rate. Now let's go into a little more detail on this stuff and give you a little more perspective before we finish up. If you go down the list of gyrosync denoms, you'll note that I'm always telling you to run the gyrosync denom as fast as possible to reduce aliasing. And if you want to know more about aliasing, I'll link you to another video of mine in the upper right. Ding! There it is. There's basically no downside to running gyrosync denom as fast as possible. By the way, this is a little bit misleading how I've worded it here. I said run gyrosync denom as high as possible. Well, actually, the higher is a slower rate. That's kind of backwards. Gyrosync denom should be as low as possible for the fastest rate possible. So essentially, if you've got an SPI, then you run at 8 kilohertz, and if you've got an I2C, then you run at 4 kilohertz, and that's just that. There is no downside to running this as fast as possible. So even if you don't think there's a benefit to running it this fast, you might as well. There's no downside at all. Okay, so if there is a benefit, you take advantage of it. If there's not a benefit, there's no downside, just do it. PID process denom is a little bit more subjective. There may be some disadvantages to running the PID process at faster rates. For example, there is a fairly in-depth discussion going on right now about whether faster PID processes make it harder to tune the D term, because the D term, the faster you run the PID process, the more high frequency noise the PID process sees. And we've got soft filters to get rid of that noise, but there's an argument going on that running the PID process slower helps with tuning the D term, makes it easier to tune the D term because the D term isn't seeing a lot of that noise. That's a topic that is not resolved yet and is also not really a focus of this video. Suffice it to say that you don't, unlike the gyrosync denom, you do not always want to run the PID process denom necessarily as fast as you can. You can, but maybe it'll be easier for you to tune your copter. Maybe there will be some kind of weird glitches that show up at 8 kilohertz, but maybe your ESCs don't like 8 kilohertz, whatever. And going to a lower rate may be beneficial. So you got to decide for yourself. In general, I think that 2 kilohertz is a safe value for anybody who's not sure about whether they want to go to higher values. All modern setups, and by modern I mean like if you're running one shot, if your ESCs are running one shot, they can handle 2 kilohertz. If you're running BL Heli 13.6, then you might run into a problem. But if you're basically on a modern version of BL Heli and Clean Flight or Betaflight, you get no problem whatsoever with 2 kilohertz. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that most pilots are not capable of tuning or flying to a level where they would notice any difference between 2 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz or 8 kilohertz. And frankly, even some pilots who are capable of tuning or flying to a level where they definitely would notice a difference have still said they don't notice a difference. They argue that there is no difference. If you go and you look at race flight, RS2K, who is a lead or maybe the lead developer of raceflight, I don't know if there are other developers, but anyway, RS2K argues that faster gyrosync and faster motor output is definitely beneficial. The thing to keep in mind is that raceflight may be doing things with that data that Betaflight isn't doing. So there's not an either or here. If you're running raceflight, maybe you'll see some advantages to going to higher refresh rates, and maybe you won't. I don't know. But at least given the current state of Betaflight development, I think that it's safe to say that most people would be just happy at 2 kilohertz. And if you feel like pushing the limits and going to 4 kilohertz or 8 kilohertz, be my guest. You may or may not notice a difference. If you're not sure, if you just don't want to deal with it, I say run 2 kilohertz and be done. Now, why don't I say run 1 kilohertz? And the thing is, I feel like when we went from 3,500 loop time or 2,500 loop time way back when to a 1,000 loop time with gyrosync, that's 1 kilohertz. When we did that, I feel like there was a really big and noticeable improvement in copters handling and the ability to tune. And we went from 1 kilohertz to 2 kilohertz. I feel like there was still a little bit of an advantage, but maybe a little more subtle advantage. And then you go from 2 kilohertz to 4 or 8 kilohertz, and it's really questionable whether the advantage is even there, okay? So I feel like 2 kilohertz is the place where I'm absolutely sure that if there is much benefit, you're getting it. Whereas if you go to 1 kilohertz, I think that you might be in the realm where some people would notice the difference, although some people wouldn't. After all, as is famously pointed out anytime this is mentioned, KISS runs at 1 kilohertz and flies great. Okay, so I think 2 kilohertz is giving you just that little bit of extra margin to know that you're not leaving much, if any, performance on the table. And that's why I say 2 kilohertz is a safe value. If you want to go to 4 kilohertz or above, you need to be running multi-shot or one-shot 42. One-shot 125 cannot go to 4 kilohertz, and the reason for that, again, I'll leave that for a topic for another video. Actually, that's not technically true. Betaflight has a trick built into it that lets you run one-shot 125 at 4 kilohertz, but frankly, I don't recommend it. You're really just pushing things to the edge of what is really they're capable of doing. And since there's not really a definitive advantage of going from 2 to 4, why push the edge, right? Why give yourself the possibility of getting yourself in trouble? So personally, I run one-shot 125 at 2 kilohertz. And if I want to go to 4 or 8 kilohertz, I make sure that I'm running, in my case, I would run multi-shot, but you could also run one-shot 42 if that's what your ESC support. Last thing, always check the status command in the CLI. Here's an example. In the CLI, you type status and you hit enter, and here's what you see. Always check that after setting your PID process denom or setting your loop time, or if you're using the Betaflight configurator, setting your kilohertz is here. And check your CPU utilization. If your CPU utilization is too high, if it's too high, your copter won't even arm, okay? But if your CPU utilization, you can get into a scenario where on the bench, when not much is going on, your CPU utilization is okay, but then you get up in the air and you start flying and your CPU utilization can spike and it can hit the point where other processes stop working and the copter can have glitches, it can drop out of the air, etc. The guideline that I use is that the CPU utilization needs to be less than about 30 to maybe at the absolute most 40%, just sitting on the desk next to your computer with not actually flying. If it's over about 30 to 40%, I think you need to go to a slower loop time. In other words, raise PID process denom. If you're at 4 kilohertz, go to 2 kilohertz. If you're at 2 kilohertz, go to 1 kilohertz, etc. The F3 boards that we've got can run 4 or even 8 kilohertz PID process rates with acceptable loop times under many conditions. But if you're running a lot of different things, you're running LED strip, you're running soft serial, you're running a whole bunch of other processor intensive, you're running camera up tilt compensation, which is somewhat processor intensive, etc., 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 you can get yourself in a scenario where your CPU utilization is too high, and then you can get, in the worst case, your copter simply won't arm. But in an even worse case, then you can get scenarios where it seems to fly, but then it randomly glitches out. And if you're having a scenario where your copter is glitching out, dropping out of the air, or having some kind of weird intermittent problem like that, and your CPU utilization is higher than about 30 to 40%, then I think you need to go to a slower PID process denom. Okay, there you go. Now you know what to set your loop time to, or at least you have a better idea than you did coming into this, hopefully. Thanks for watching. Hope it was helpful. Happy flying.